The wind that swept across the Perm 36 airfield in the western reaches of Siberia was not merely cold, it was a possessive elemental force, a breath from the Arctic that seemed to suck the very hope from the sky. It was here, in this fortress of concrete and secrecy, ringed by endless birch forests and monitored by watchtowers, that the Soviet Union nurtured its most desperate dreams of strategic parity. For decades, the vast empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean had been America's greatest shield. Soviet bombers, the lumbering bears, the sleek but limited bisons, could threaten Europe, could probe the edges of Alaska, but to reach the heartland of the United States, they would have to run a gauntlet of NORAD interceptors and carrier groups, a suicidal mission. The dream was a bomber that could fly over the Pacific, not around it. A machine that could launch from Siberian ice, strike Chicago or Los Angeles, and return home, a dagger thrust that would finally, truly, make the Cold War cold for both sides. In the early 1960s, a feverish belief took hold in the darkened offices of the Tupolev Design Bureau and the innermost chambers of the Kremlin. They had finally built it. The project was born from a direct, furious command from Nikita Khrushchev himself, still smarting from the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He demanded not an incremental improvement, but a leap into the future. The result was designated, with dry bureaucratic inevitability, as Aircraft 135. But to the handful of Air Force generals and party officials cleared for its existence, it was known by a more potent code name, Project Burlak, the Hauler, a name that spoke of brute, unstoppable force. And it was a beast. On the drafting tables and in the wind tunnels, it took shape as something alien to Soviet aviation tradition. It was enormous, with a fuselage like a stretched, polished bullet, large enough to house a cavernous weapons bay and the complex plumbing for in-flight refueling, a capability they intended to master for redundancy. But its true genius, its terrifying promise, lay in two revolutionary features. First, its engines. It was to be powered by four next-generation Kuznetsov NK-25 turbofans, engines that promised not just thrust, but efficiency, giving the Burlak a projected unrefueled range of over 14,000 kilometers, just enough for the Pacific round trip with a margin for evasion. Second, and most critically, its payload. It was designed not just to carry free-fall bombs, but the new generation of supersonic air-launched cruise missiles, each tipped with a thermonuclear warhead capable of melting entire cities in the clinical parlance of the target planners. This was not a bomber meant to penetrate at low altitude. It was a high-altitude, high-speed launch platform, a flying missile silo that would stand off from the American coast and unleash apocalypse from a distance. Yet for all the blueprints and calculations, an aircraft is made more than paper. It is made of metal, sweat, and fear. As the first full-scale prototype, Burlak 1, began to take shape in a specially constructed climate-controlled hangar at Perm 36, the men who would build it and eventually fly it beheld its form. The scale was imposing, the lines predatory, but it was the wings that arrested the eye, that dominated the space. They were long, impossibly slender, sweeping back from the fuselage with a grace that seemed at odds with the machine's purpose. They whispered of speed, of the upper stratosphere. It was in the hangar, under the pitiless glow of mercury vapor lamps, that the whispers began among the ground crews and the junior test pilots. They didn't call it Burlak. They looked at those sleek, deadly wings, at the way the light seemed to shiver along their leading edges, and they gave it another name, a name that was passed in low tones during smoke breaks in the freezing air outside, a name that spoke of inherent danger, the knife wing. The wings of the Burlak were not merely a supporting structure, they were the soul of the aircraft, the product of a Soviet moonshot in material science. The problem was simple physics. To achieve the required range, the wings needed to be enormously long to provide lift with minimal drag. But long wings are inflexible, and for a bomber intended to fly at the edge of space and then potentially descend to evade interception, maneuverability was paramount. The American solution, seen in the experimental XB-70 Valkyrie, was fixed delta wings, incredibly fast but limited in range and low-speed handling. The Tupolev engineers, led by a brilliant obsessive metallurgist named Dr. Ilya Fyodorov, proposed something radically different, a variable geometry wing. But this was not the simple pivot wing of the later Tu-160 Blackjack or the American F-111. The Burlak's wings were designed to be morphing. Using a network of internal hydraulic actuators and a revolutionary control system, the wings could perform a ballet of deformation in flight. For takeoff and landing, they would extend almost straight out, maximizing lift at low speed. For high-speed cruise, they would sweep back to a sharp, narrow, dagger-like profile. And for high-altitude loiter or maneuvering, subtle twists and camber adjustments could be made along their entire length, optimizing performance in real time for conditions. It was a concept decades ahead of its time, a wing that lived and breathed. The miracle and the curse was the material that made it possible. Dr. Fyodorov's team, working in a secret institute near the Ural Mountains, had developed an experimental alloy they designated Vibranium K, a nod to both vibration resistance and the KGB's oversight. It was a titanium, aluminum, vanadium matrix doped with trace elements of rare earth minerals and processed under intense magnetic fields, resulting in a metal that was stronger than any aviation-grade steel, yet significantly lighter. It had a crystalline structure that could tolerate microscopic flexing without metal fatigue. It was on paper perfect. In reality, it was unstable. The processing created a surface phenomenon the scientists had noted but disastrously underestimated. The outer molecular layer of the alloy, under certain conditions, could undergo a phase shift, aligning into microscopically thin, interlocking platelets, incredibly hard but with edges sharper than surgical steel on a nanometer scale. Under the immense, controlled forces of flight, these platelets would lay flat, providing a smooth, hyper-durable surface. But at rest, or when subjected to a sudden, localized pressure, like the touch of a human hand, the platelets could delaminate and stand on edge. The first incident occurred during a pre-dawn inspection in the spring of 1964. A senior mechanic named Anatoly Vorolin, a man with 20 years of experience who treated aircraft with a craftsman's reverence, was walking the port wing of Burlak 1. A checklist called for a visual inspection of a hydraulic line coupling near the wing root. The access panel was stiff. Vorolin, his breath fogging in the chilled hangar air, placed his left hand on the wing's surface for leverage as he tugged with his right. There was no sound, no screech of tearing metal. He felt only a sudden, icy sensation followed by a warmth. He looked down. His heavy leather work glove appeared intact, but a dark stain was rapidly spreading across the palm. He pulled his hand away. The glove's palm fell away in a perfectly sliced flap as if cut by a laser. Beneath, the flesh of his hand was laid open to the bone in 3 parallel, razor-straight lines that began to weep blood in pulses. The alloy's surface, where his hand had rested, now showed a faint frosted patch. A million microscopic blades standing upright where the pressure had triggered the phase shift. Varrola nearly lost 2 fingers to the ensuing infection from the ultra-fine metallic dust that had penetrated the wound. The official report termed it a laceration incident due to a sharp burr. But in the hangar, the truth was known. The wing had cut him. The knife wing had drawn first blood. A panic, cold and professional, descended on Project Burlak. Dr. Fyodorov was summoned from his institute. Under glaring lights, he demonstrated the phenomenon with a sample of the alloy and a block of paraffin wax. A gentle press of the wax onto the seemingly smooth metal resulted in the wax block coming away with deep, clean slices carved into it. The surface is in a metastable state. The tension in the control bunker at Perm 36 was a physical substance, thick enough to taste. It was the taste of ozone from the banks of radar scopes, of stale cigarette smoke, of cold sweat on starched collars. A gallery of high-ranking observers had descended from Moscow. Air Force generals with chests full of medals, stone-faced party apparatchiks, and a smattering of scientists, including Dr. Fyodorov, who looked as if he hadn't slept in weeks. They were all crammed into the low-ceilinged concrete room, their eyes fixed on the single large plexiglass plot table, where a female operator moved a single marked disc, Burlak 1, with a long wooden rod. Outside, beyond the armored glass, the Siberian dawn was a pale, watery smear on the horizon. The wind had dropped to an ominous whisper. On the tarmac, the knife wing sat under arc lights, a specter of polished gunmetal gray. It looked less like a machine and more like a predatory fossil excavated from some future ice age. Ground crews in their bulky protective suits moved around it like monks tending a dangerous relic, their movements slow, ritualistic, avoiding any contact with the fuselage, especially the long, silent wings. The chief test pilot, Colonel Mikhail Misha Volkov, a veteran of the Arctic patrol runs, and a man of few words and absolute nerve, completed his final checks in the cockpit, a space that felt more like a submarine's control room than an aircraft's, dominated by heavy levers for the morphing wings and banks of analog gauges. At 0617, Volkov's voice crackled over the bunker's speaker, calm and flat. Burlak 1, requesting clearance for engine start and taxi. Permission granted. The 4 NK-25s whined into life, their exhaust shimmering the air. The sound was not the deafening roar of the older turbojets, but a deeper, more focused thunder, a sound of contained and promised fury. The bomber taxied slowly, its alien grace apparent even on the ground. At the runway threshold, it paused. In the bunker, every breath was held. Burlak 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed. The thunder deepened. The bomber began to roll, gathering speed with an eager, frightening quickness. Then the nose lifted and kept lifting. The aircraft seemed to leap into the air, climbing at an angle that drew a collective gasp from the bunker. It wasn't the labored, grinding ascent of the bear or the bison. It was the strike of a hawk. Positive rate. Gear up, Volkov reported, his voice still devoid of emotion. Initiating wing sweep sequence. This was the moment. On the plot table, the operator's hand trembled slightly as she awaited the data. The wings, designed to sweep from 20 degrees for takeoff to a planned 65 degrees for high-speed cruise, were a mystery in motion. Telemetry streamed in. The sweep was smooth, incremental, flawless. The aircraft continued to climb, a dark arrowhead piercing the morning haze, shrinking to a speck, then vanishing into the high overcast. For the next 4 hours, the bunker monitored a stream of data that seemed too good to be true. The Burlak wasn't just meeting its design specifications, it was obliterating them. It reached its designated cruise altitude of 18,000 meters. Then, with fuel to spare, Volkov requested and was granted permission to climb further. The bomber ascended to 22,000 meters, deep into the stratosphere, a realm where the sky was black and the stars were visible at noon. Its speed, pegged at a planned Mach 2.1, crept up to a sustained Mach 2.3. Most critically, the fuel consumption was 12% lower than the most optimistic projections. The new engines hummed with efficient power. The morphing wings were delivering their promised miracle of low drag and high lift. General Karpov, the head of long-range aviation, allowed himself a rare, tight smile. Lighting a papyrose. "Comrades," he said to the room, the smoke curling around his words, "what you are witnessing is not an aircraft. It is a geopolitical fact. The Pacific Ocean is now a Soviet lake." The statement hung in the air, a manifesto of newfound power. In that bunker, they believed they had unlocked the final piece of the strategic puzzle. The Burlak could fly from here, from Perm 36, climb to an altitude where American interceptors of the era, the F-102s, the F-106s, could not reach, dash across the polar cap or the North Pacific at speeds that would outrun any missile, launch its cruise payloads from a standoff range, and turn for home before the first alarm bell finished ringing in the Pentagon. It was the ultimate deterrent, a perfect monster of the skies. The Americans wouldn't see it coming because by the time their radars could paint it, it would already be turning away, its deadly eggs already hatched and screaming toward their targets. When Burlak 1 finally descended, executing a smooth, slow-wing landing that belied its immense size, a wave of restrained euphoria swept the complex. Volkov emerged from the cockpit, his flight suit dry, his face unreadable. To the eager questions from the engineers, he gave only a pilot's verdict. It flies very well. But in his debrief, he noted one thing, a minor anomaly he attributed to new aircraft quirks, a very faint, almost subaudible hum that seemed to come from the airframe itself at maximum speed, a sensation more felt in the bones than heard. It was logged, and in the triumph of the day, largely dismissed. The second test flight 2 weeks later was not a celebration, it was a confirmation. The mission profile was more aggressive, a high-speed, high-altitude dash simulating a penetration profile, followed by a series of controlled maneuvers to test the wing morphing under stress. The mood was confident, almost casual. The monster had been tamed. The generals were already drafting their reports to the Central Committee. Colonel Volkov was again at the controls, with a new co-pilot, Captain Leonid Zorin, a talented but less experienced flyer. The takeoff and climb were a repeat of the first flight's brilliance. The Burlak sliced into the stratosphere, a silver ghost against the infinite blue-black. It leveled off at 21,000 meters and accelerated to Mach 2.2. The data flowing back to Perm 36 was, once again, perfect. Then, at the 37-minute mark of the high-speed cruise, Captain Zorn's voice came over the radio, a note of uncertainty bleeding through. "Control, we are experiencing a resonance, a vibration. It is not in the engines." Volkov, his hands on the controls, felt it too. It started as that same faint hum from the first flight, but it was intensifying. It was a deep, metallic singing, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the aircraft, bypassing the engines and the airflow. It traveled up the control columns, into the seat frames, a buzzing in the teeth and the spine. "Describe it," Control demanded. "It is a harmonic," Volkov replied, his voice now edged with focus. "Low frequency, increasing in amplitude. It is structural." In the bunker, Dr. Fyodorov went pale. He stared at a separate telemetry feed, one monitoring strain gauges embedded in the wing spars. The numbers, which had been holding steady, began to oscillate. Not wildly, but with a disturbing rhythmic pulse that matched the crew's description. The alloy was not just bearing the load, it was vibrating with it. "Burlak 1, recommend you reduce speed and initiate descent," the flight director ordered, his confidence gone. "Executing," Volkov said. But as he eased the throttles back and began a gentle descent, the vibration changed. The harmonic found a new, terrible sympathy. The deep hum fractured into a violent, shuddering buzz. In the cockpit, a warning light illuminated, a yellow caution for the port wing hydraulic system. Then a red light, a structural integrity sensor in the left wing root. Before Volkov could speak, there was a sound, not over the radio, but a sound the crew heard through the airframe, a deafening, catastrophic twang, like a gargantuan piano string snapping. The aircraft jerked violently to the left. "Left wing failure, major asymmetry," Volkov barked, his hands a blur on the controls, fighting the sudden, terrifying roll. Alarms screamed in the cockpit. The shuddering was now a brutal, jarring hammering, threatening to shake the aircraft apart. Somehow, through sheer skill and a gambler's instinct, Volkov wrestled the crippled behemoth out of its death spiral. He killed the portside engines to reduce drag, deployed the landing gear and full-span flaps early to create drag and stability, and began a desperate, sliding, unbalanced descent. He was no longer flying an aircraft, he was guiding a wounded, bucking building back to Earth. The emergency landing was a controlled crash. The Burlak hit the runway on its right main gear and the portside engine nasal, slewing sideways in a shower of sparks and screeching metal before lurching to a stop halfway through the overrun area. Fire trucks and ambulances converged, their sirens a futile echo of the aircraft's own death cry. The crew emerged shaken but alive, a testament to Volkov's preternatural skill. The aircraft, however, was a maimed thing. The left wing, though still attached, sagged grotesquely, its leading edge kinked. The inspection that followed was a descent into a new kind of terror. When engineers, clad in their protective suits, finally accessed the internal structure of the wounded wing, they expected to see classic metal fatigue, crack lines, stress fractures, torn rivets. That would have been a failure they understood. What they found was incomprehensible. The internal titanium spars, the very bones of the wing, made from the vibranium K alloy, were not cracked. They were transformed. In sections subjected to the greatest stress, the metal's surface had a strange, fibrous, almost woody texture. Core samples, when extracted, revealed a nightmare. The crystalline structure of the alloy had not simply failed, it had reorganized. Under the combined pressures of flight load, temperature differential, and the internal vibration it had generated, the metastable material had begun a spontaneous, catastrophic phase transition. The molecular platelets, designed to lay flat, had realigned into interlocking needle-like dendrites that grew internally, prying the metal apart from within. It wasn't fatigue, it was a cancer. The alloy wasn't just unstable, it was evolving. It was responding to its environment in a way that defied the laws of passive material science. Under stress, it was changing its fundamental nature, seeking a new, disastrous equilibrium. The vibration wasn't a symptom of failure, it was the sound of the material reconstituting itself, a physical hum of transformation that generated destructive frequencies. The metal was, in the most horrifyingly literal sense, alive with entropy. It was a technological malignancy. The knife wing hadn't broken because it was weak, it had broken because its very essence was a beautifully engineered flaw, a material that carried the seed of its own self-destruction, waiting for the right conditions, the very conditions of its designed purpose, to bloom. The silence that fell over the Perm 36 complex in the aftermath of the second flight was deeper and more profound than the Siberian winter. It was not the silence of shock, which is noisy with gasps and exclamations, but the silence of institutional terror, of a vast machine grinding into reverse with ruthless, oiled efficiency. The dream of the Pacific Crossing spearhead had, in a matter of minutes, curdled into a nightmare of existential liability. The first word came not from the Air Force, but from the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, responsible for scientific and technical security. Men in long, dark woolen coats arrived within hours, their faces as impassive as the Ural Mountains. They did not ask questions, they issued commands. They cordoned off the crippled Burlak 1 with a ring of their own guards, supplanting the air police. They sealed the design bureaus, the metallurgy labs, and even Dr. Feodorov's office at the distant institute. Every document, every blueprint, every stress calculation, every page of the laboratory log detailing the creation of Vibranium K was confiscated. They didn't just collect files, they oversaw their physical destruction in industrial incinerators, the flames consuming not just paper, but a decade of theoretical work and billions of rubles of investment. The human element was addressed with chilling bureaucratic finality. The engineers and technicians who had lived and breathed the morphing wing mechanisms were not debriefed, they were dissolved. Some, the senior designers with irreplaceable but problematic knowledge, were given sudden lavish promotions to obscure teaching posts at technical universities in Vladivostok or Minsk, places far from any active design bureau. Others, the junior technicians and welders who had hands-on experience with the cursed alloy, found themselves on trains to new, monumental construction projects in Siberia or the Kazakh steppe, their skills reassigned to digging tunnels or pouring concrete. A few, those deemed too knowledgeable or too potentially talkative, like Anatoly Voronin, the mechanic who had first been cut by the wing, simply vanished from the rolls. They were reported as transferred to a closed facility, a phrase that carried the same weight as an obituary. The message was seared into the consciousness of everyone who remained. Project Burlak had never existed, and to remember it was a treasonous act. The aircraft itself, the physical proof of the failure, presented a unique problem. It was too large, too iconic to simply melt down. Its destruction would require explanations, leave a logistical footprint. Instead, they chose to bury it alive. Burlak 1 was dragged, its broken wings screeching in protest, into the deepest, most remote hangar at the edge of the Perm 36 complex, a structure known as Bunker 7. The massive reinforced doors, designed to withstand a near miss from a nuclear blast, were rolled shut. Inside, in the perpetual, dusty twilight, the bomber was treated not as a piece of machinery, but as a radioactive or biologically hazardous specimen. It was swathed in layers of non-reactive plastic sheeting. Yellow and black warning tape, reading, "Stoi! Opasnost! Zapreshennaya zona! Stop! Danger! Forbidden zone!" was crisscrossed over every access point. Armed guards from a dedicated, silent unit were posted outside the bunker doors 24 hours a day, their orders simple: admit no one under any circumstances, and record any sounds from within. The official death certificate for Project Burlak was issued by the Ministry of Aviation in a single-paragraph memo distributed to a very limited list. It stated that during advanced testing of experimental materials for long-range aviation, certain material inconsistencies were discovered that rendered the primary design concept unsuitable for further development. All resources have been reallocated to more promising, conventional technologies. It was a masterpiece of dead language, a nothing burger of an explanation designed to bore any curious party official into looking elsewhere. But in the smoke-filled back rooms of the Kremlin and in the hushed corridors of the KGB's Lubyanka headquarters, the unofficial truth was understood. The Soviet Union had not just suffered a technical setback, it had birthed a monster. They had created a weapon system so advanced it had crossed into a realm of unpredictable danger. The Burlak was too dangerous to maintain. Its very skin could maim its caretakers. It was too unpredictable to trust. Its core material could turn on itself mid-mission, transforming a strategic asset into a falling coffin over friendly or enemy territory. And yet it was too valuable to destroy. The knowledge it represented, the fleeting glimpse of performance supremacy it had achieved, was a siren song. To annihilate it completely would be to admit the future was forever out of reach. So they did the only thing they could. They placed it in a deep freeze, a technological cryosleep, hoping that perhaps one day someone smarter might find a cure for its sickness. They entombed their Icarus. For nearly a decade, Burlak 1 slept in its concrete tomb. The world moved on. The Soviet military-industrial complex poured its resources into the safer, more predictable Tu-95 Bear and the nascent Tu-160 Blackjack programs. The Pacific deterrent was managed through submarine-launched ballistic missiles, a less elegant but far more stable solution. The legend of the Knife Wing faded to a ghost story told by retired engineers over forbidden bottles of vodka, a tale of the time they almost touched the sun. Then, in the tense autumn of 1970, the geopolitical ice cracked again. A series of confrontations, the bombing of North Vietnam, aggressive U.S. naval maneuvers, and a hair-trigger nuclear alert triggered by a false radar reading sent relations into a deep freeze. In the Kremlin, the old fears resurged. The submarine fleet was powerful, but it was a hidden dagger. There was a renewed, desperate craving for a weapon that could show itself, that could parade in the skies as a visible, undeniable threat. In a closed-door meeting of the Defense Council, an aged but still influential marshal, a survivor of Stalingrad, pounded the table. We need a sword to hold to their throat, not a poison in their wine. What of the Burlak, the bomber that could fly to America? A reactivation study was ordered. It was a desperate, nostalgic gamble. A hand-picked team of the new generation's best engineers and technicians, men with no connection to the original disaster, was assembled at Perm 36 under a new, innocuous codename. Their mandate: assess the feasibility of returning the buried aircraft to flight status, perhaps with conventional wings, perhaps by solving the alloy mystery. With great ceremony, the KGB guards were stood down. The massive bolts on Bunker 7 were shot back for the first time in 9 years. The heavy doors groaned open on rusting tracks, letting a shaft of cold Siberian light pierce the interior gloom. The team, led by a confident young chief engineer named Grigorenko, stepped inside, their breath fogging in the stagnant air. The sight that greeted them stole the breath from their lungs. The Burlak was still there, a giant shrouded in dusty plastic. But its silhouette was wrong, profoundly wrong. The iconic, sleek, predatory stance was gone. The long, slender wings, which should have been angled slightly upward in their parked position, had sagged. They drooped downward from the roots, their tips now almost touching the concrete floor, giving the aircraft a grotesque, weary, vulture-like posture. The plastic sheeting over the wings was strained and torn in places, not from external force, but from the internal deformation of the structure it covered. A superstitious dread filled the bunker. Grigorenko, forcing himself to act, ordered the plastic removed from the port wing, the one that had failed. As the layers were peeled back, the team gasped. The wing's surface, once a smooth, polished gunmetal gray, was now mottled with strange iridescent patches like the tarnish on old silver or the skin of a rotting fish. But more terrifying was the curvature. It wasn't a clean bend from a structural failure. It was a warping, a slow gravitational flow of the metal as if it had been made of wax and left near a low heat for a decade. The leading edge, designed to be knife-sharp, was now blunted and rippled. Using ultrasonic scanners and newly developed fiber-optic probes, they examined the internal spars. The horror of the initial failure had not been a finale, it had been an opening act. The phase shift cancer within the vibranium K had not gone dormant. In the stillness, without the stabilizing influence of flight dynamics, it had continued its silent metamorphic work. The dendritic needles had grown, branched, and multiplied, turning the internal structure into a brittle crystalline sponge. The alloy was not inert. It was a slow-motion chemical reaction pretending to be metal, continuing to transmute itself at a molecular level, seeking some final, catastrophic state of equilibrium. The sagging wings were not a result of faulty supports. They were the visible symptom of the material literally creeping under its own weight, its internal strength leaching away year after year. Grigorenko's report was unequivocal and damning. Reactivation was not merely impossible, it was unthinkable. The aircraft was not a dormant asset, it was an active hazard. The report stated, with chilling precision, that the airframe's structural integrity was less than zero, that any attempt to move it, let alone pressurize it or subject it to aerodynamic forces, would result in catastrophic, spontaneous structural disaggregation. The final recommendation was stark. The object represents a clear and present danger to personnel and infrastructure. The only safe course of action is its total, controlled disassembly in situ within a contained environment. But even that recommendation was too dangerous for the authorities to accept. Disassembly meant touching it, cutting it, disturbing it. Who knows what clouds of microscopic, razor-sharp particles might be released? What final, violent phase shift might be triggered? The political will to deal with the problem evaporated instantly. The reactivation team was disbanded, sworn to a new, even more severe layer of secrecy. The doors of Bunker 7 were sealed again, this time with welders adding fresh steel bars across them. The guards returned to their posts, their orders updated. The threat was no longer one of espionage, but of contamination. The final, bitter irony was understood by all who knew the truth. The Soviet Union's greatest bid for aerial supremacy, the bomber designed to hold the American mainland at risk, had met its end not on a runway or in combat, but in a silent concrete vault. Its final mission was one of passive, glacial self-destruction. The knife wing was no longer a weapon. It was a patient in terminal decline, a threatening, radioactive relic that was too perilous to approach, too sinister to destroy, and too haunting to forget. It stood, rather, it slumped, as a monument, not to triumph, but to the terrifying truth that some thresholds once crossed cannot be uncrossed, and some monsters, once created, cannot be killed. The sagging, silent horror inside Bunker 7 could not be allowed to exist in perpetuity. It was a festering secret, a geological fault line of human error running through the bedrock of Soviet military confidence. By the mid-1970s, a new generation of leaders in the Kremlin, men less emotionally invested in the old dream and more concerned with pragmatic arms control treaties like SALT, looked at the ongoing expense reports for guarding a crumbling hangar in Siberia and saw only liability. The Burlak had passed from being a potential asset to an active embarrassment, and finally, to a costly, dangerous nuisance. The decision was made. It would be erased, not with a bang, but with the most meticulous, fearful whisper of bureaucracy. The operation, codenamed Chishtka, cleansing, was a testament to the unique paranoia the aircraft inspired. This was not a typical scrapyard dismantling. No cutting torches would kiss its skin, no wrecking balls would swing. The team assembled was a hybrid of forensic pathologists and bomb disposal experts, led not by an engineer, but by a senior KGB officer from the Chemical and Biological Weapons Directorate. Their approach was of absolute containment. They built a sarcophagus around the sarcophagus. First, a positive pressure, air-sealed tent was constructed inside Bunker 7, enveloping the entire aircraft. Air filters capable of trapping micron-sized particles ran constantly. Anyone entering wore not just the old padded suits, but fully enclosed supplied air hazmat gear, making them look like cosmonauts exploring a toxic moon. Dismantling began with the safe components, the avionics racks, the ejection seats, the instrument panels. These were carefully removed, cataloged, and immediately fed into an industrial crusher that had been brought into the hangar. The NK-25 engines, each a masterpiece of propulsion, were not salvaged. They were treated as contaminated. Their cores were filled with a quick-setting epoxy resin, turning them into inert, heavy blocks before being removed for burial. Then came the fuselage. Using massive, remote-controlled hydraulic cutters mounted on robotic arms, technology borrowed from the nuclear industry, the team severed the cockpit section, the central weapons bay, and the tail assembly at their main structural junctions. The cuts were made slowly, with constant misting of a special polymer gel designed to trap any dust or microscopic shards. Each section was then wrapped in multiple layers of lead-lined rubberized fabric, creating giant, shapeless cocoons that were lifted by silent electric cranes and placed onto waiting, sealed flatbed trucks. These trucks did not head to a scrapyard. They drove, under heavy escort, to a remote corner of the Novaya Zemlya nuclear test archipelago in the Arctic Ocean, where the cocoons were placed in a deep trench covered in concrete and forgotten. But the wings presented the ultimate problem. The reports from the 1970 assessment team were unequivocal. The Vibranium K was still active, still metastable. Cutting them, even with the robotic arms, risked an unpredictable release of energy or particulate matter. The very act of severing them might trigger a final violent phase transition. They could not be cut. They could not be moved in one piece, and they absolutely could not be left where they were. The solution was a piece of macabre, practical genius. The engineers designed and built a massive, double-walled steel cradle, its interior surfaces lined with a soft, ablative ceramic foam. In a painstaking, week-long operation, they used hydraulic jacks to gently, incrementally lift the entire sagging airframe just enough to slide this cradle underneath the wing roots. Then, with agonizing slowness, they detached the fuselage connections that had not already been cut. Bolts were drilled out, not unscrewed. Electrical and hydraulic lines were sealed with molten solder. Finally, with a series of synchronized remote-controlled hydraulic rams, they pushed the monstrous, deformed wings downward, away from the fuselage stubs. There was no dramatic crash, only a soft, gritty sigh as the ceramic foam compressed, cradling the lethal load. What remained were two intact, warped, and eerily beautiful wings, each over 30 meters long, resting in their protective steel cocoon. This cradle was then itself sealed, the seams welded shut by men in suits who worked in 15-minute shifts due to the psychological strain. The resulting container was a monstrous rectangular coffin. The final journey was made at night. A specially reinforced transporter, normally used for moving intercontinental ballistic missile stages, carried the sealed cradle out of Bunker 7, across the darkened tarmac, and onto a spur of railway that led away from the Perm 36 complex. The train traveled for 2 days and nights, deep into the uninhabited taiga of the Yamal Peninsula, a place of permafrost and utter desolation. At the end of the line was a newly constructed site, a simple concrete pad overlooking a shaft that dropped 150 meters straight down into the frozen earth. The shaft had been lined not just with concrete, but with a liner of baked clay and borated polymer, materials chosen for their ability to absorb radiation and contain chemical seepage, a design borrowed from plans for eternal nuclear waste storage. With a silence that felt sacred, the crane lowered the winged coffin into the deep, cold dark. It descended for what seemed like an eternity before a distant, echoing thud signaled it had reached the bottom. Then the entombment began. First, a slurry of fine, dry sand was pumped in, filling every cavity around the cradle. Then came layer after layer of liquid concrete, each allowed to set before the next was poured, creating a monolithic artificial geology. Finally, the shaft itself was plugged with a 50-meter-thick cap of reinforced concrete and compacted earth. The surface was graded, covered with tundra sod, and left to the wind and the snow. No marker was placed. No record of the coordinates was kept in any central archive. The knowledge was split, compartmentalized among a few KGB officers who would take it to their graves. The official file on Project Burlak was closed with a final one-sentence entry, quote, "Experimental airframe 135 dismantled and disposed of per Protocol 781 Alpha," unquote. No recoverable assets. But secrets, especially those forged in metal and fear, have long half-lives. Among the retired engineers, the ones who had been reassigned and now lived in small apartments in distant cities, the legend did not die. They would gather years later after the fall of the Soviet Union, and over glasses of tea or something stronger, the whispers would resume. Quote, "They didn't bury it in Novaya Zemlya with the rest. The wings went somewhere else, somewhere deep," unquote. Quote, "Fyodorov, before they took him, he told me the alloy wasn't stable. It was in a state of potential. He said cutting it would be like striking a match in a room full of vapor. You wouldn't know what kind of flame you'd get," unquote. Quote, "I heard from a man who drove a special train north of the Arctic Circle. He said the cargo was cold, not just cold from the air, but cold like it was drinking the heat from the car. They wore sheepskin coats inside the cabin," unquote. And the most persistent, chilling rumor of all passed from one grizzled veteran to another. Quote, "It's still moving down there. Not much. A millimeter a year, maybe. The metal, it's settling, or it's growing. They didn't bury a machine. They buried a seed." The Burlak, the knife wing, faded into the vast dark tapestry of Cold War ghosts. It was a failed miracle of aviation, a gleaming promise that turned to poison in the crucible of reality. It was the ultimate expression of a weapon too dangerous to build, not because of its payload, but because of its very bones. A bomber that could not be trusted by the men who built it, flown by the men who crewed it, or touched by the men who maintained it. But for those 2 brief, shining flights, it had touched the future. Colonel Volkov, before his own quiet retirement, would sometimes look up at the contrail of a high-flying jet, a faint, wistful look in his eyes. He had felt it. The effortless climb, the silent rush of the stratosphere, the immense humming power of a machine perfectly married to its purpose. For a few hours, he had held the keys to a machine that could have crossed the Pacific, that could have looked down on the defenses of a continent and laughed. It was a promise of parity, of a world reshaped by a single, breathtaking leap of technology. That promise now lies buried under 150 meters of frozen Siberian earth, sealed in a concrete womb, a silent, shifting monument to the line between ambition and hubris, and to the terrifying truth that sometimes the most dangerous